A lasagna scorched beyond recognition, except one clue Wolfe can't ignore. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Hearing from you adds spice to every story. Let's dive in. It all started with a smell, and I'm not talking about your usual kitchen perfume. Garlic doing a foxtrot with oregano, tomato paste humming along in the background. No, this was sharp, acrid, with a bitter note that didn't belong in Fritz's kitchen or anywhere within a city block of Nero Wolfe's sacred table. I was in the front room with a newspaper folded like an accordion and a crossword half finished when I smelled it. A kind of betrayal sizzling in the oven. "Archie," Wolfe's voice floated out from the dining room with the controlled gravity of a man watching someone rearrange his book collection by color. "Attend to Fritz." That told me something was wrong. Wolfe rarely interrupted any stage of dinner. His, mine, or the food's. If he had spoken during the last minute of a lasagna's life in the oven, it meant the situation was nothing short of a culinary crime scene. In the kitchen, Fritz was hovering like a distressed maestro who'd just discovered a trombone in his string quartet. He held the lasagna dish like it had insulted his lineage. I stepped in before he could throw it out the window. "Burnt?" I asked. "Yes," Fritz breathed, as if confessing a sin to St. Peter. "But not from time, not from heat, from something else." I leaned in. The center of the top layer was blackened in a very particular way, circular, like something had scorched it with intent. The rest of the lasagna was untouched. No uneven heat, no clumsy overbake, just one perfect, nasty little crater. "You sure this didn't happen in the oven?" I asked. Fritz shot me a look that reminded me who made my eggs Florentine every Sunday. "I layered it myself. I watched it bubble. I opened the oven once. This was not there. Not until I turned away. Someone touched it." That got my attention. Not just because I don't like mystery meat with a side of sabotage, but because this was Wolfe's house. Nobody touches Fritz's food. Nobody dares. I brought the dish out and set it on the dining table like it was evidence. Wolfe looked at it. Didn't sniff, didn't prod. Just stared with the expression of a man who has been personally betrayed by a casserole. "Lasagna is to be served unbroken," he said, his tone even. Uncompromised. Fritz stood silent, ashamed, and I found myself defending the guy. He didn't break it. Someone else did. Wolfe turned to me, arching one brow in a way that would have passed for outrage if it weren't so measured. "In this house?" "In this house," I said. "Kitchen door was open for 5 minutes, maybe." I went to get the mail. Fritz took a call from a delivery service confirming his balsamic shipment, and boom. Sabotaged. "Lasagna." "You're suggesting," Wolfe said slowly, "that an intruder entered my kitchen, scorched my lasagna, and fled. All without motive?" "Not without motive," I said. "Look closer." I slid the dish toward him and pointed to the blackened circle. From above it looked random, but from the side, where the burnt edge curved into the ricotta layer below, you could just make out the ghost of something that didn't belong there. A shape. A letter. "Is that an L?" Wolfe murmured. "Or a 7, or a fragment of a circle." I wasn't going to bet money. But Wolfe had already made up his mind. "Remove that abomination," he said to Fritz, "and bring me a sandwich. Also, Archie. Someone is trying to speak to me." "Well, if that's how they deliver messages," I said, "I'd prefer a postcard." "No," Wolfe said. "They want my attention. They've earned it. We shall oblige." Now, if you've never watched Nero Wolfe get interested in something that touches both food and insult, you're in for a treat. He's like a volcano that stews for hours, lets out a puff of steam, and then erupts by dictating a letter. In this case, he skipped the lava and went straight to the smoke signals. he sent me upstairs to his office to retrieve his address book. Not the public one in the drawer marked clients, but the private one tucked behind the girder, full of names he didn't want Inspector Kramer or anyone else leafing through. Wolfe had two types of relationships, those he tolerated and those he remembered precisely because he didn't. He flipped through it slowly and tapped a finger on a name I hadn't heard in 3 years. "Judith Verona," he said. "Call her." I blinked. "The Judith Verona?" He gave me a look that could have chilled bourbon. The woman who once insisted I taste her tomato sauce. That Judith Verona. Judith Verona was a celebrity chef with a TV contract, a best-selling memoir called Tears in the Marinade, and a tongue sharper than her knives. She had visited the Brownstone years ago to pitch a collaborative cookbook with Wolfe. He'd declined, on the grounds that no woman who used sugar in red sauce could be trusted. She'd left in a huff, but not without promising Wolfe would one day regret snubbing her. "Call her," Wolfe repeated. "If she is involved, we will know." Fritz returned with the sandwich, beef tongue with mustard on rye, and Wolfe took one bite before waving me toward the phone. I dialed. Judith answered on the third ring. "This is Archie Goodwin," I said. "Remember me?" "Of course," she said smoothly. "You're the one who pours the wine and rolls his eyes." "Correct," I said. "And I have a question for you. Did you leave something burnt in our lasagna this evening?" There was a pause, then a low laugh. "Tell Nero Wolfe that not all messages are meant to be tasted. Sometimes they're meant to be solved." She hung up. I looked at Wolfe. "She says the clue's in the flavor." "Idiotic woman," Wolfe muttered. "Yet intriguing." And just like that, the hook was in. Not because someone burnt our dinner, but because someone had turned food into a puzzle and tried to bait the one man on earth too proud to ignore a culinary insult. "Archie," Wolfe said, "we are engaged." And the war over one ruined lasagna had begun. The next morning started with a drizzle outside and a cloud of suspicion inside. Fritz had sterilized the kitchen like it was a crime scene, which, in his book, it was. Wolfe had spent the better part of the evening sitting in his chair with his eyes half closed, chewing slowly, not on the tongue sandwich, but on Judith Verona's cryptic comment. I'd known the man long enough to tell when something gnawed at him, and believe me, this one had teeth. It was just after 10 when I got the call. "Goodwin," I said into the receiver. A hushed voice replied, "She said you'd answer." "Judith Verona." The voice wasn't hers. It belonged to someone younger, male, and definitely spooked. She told me to say, "It's not about the flavor. It's about the heat source." Then he hung up. I stared at the receiver like it had started speaking Greek. Wolfe looked up from his orchid journal, raising an eyebrow. I relayed the message, and he responded with a grunt. Not hers. She would never offer clarification without metaphor. I nodded. Someone else then. A messenger. Or a confederate. Either way, we must understand what they meant. Heat source. He fell silent. That's how he preferred to think. No pacing, no scribbling, just silence thick enough to butter toast with. I waited, because trying to rush Wolfe was like pushing a mountain with a feather duster. Finally, he spoke. "Archie, go to Judith Verona's restaurant. Observe. Make inquiries." "Of course," I said. "What's the cover?" "You are a potential investor," he said, waving a hand. "You're impressed by her blend of spectacle and cuisine and wish to expand her brand to the Midwest. So I'm a sucker," he shrugged. "A plausible one." Fritz had a car ready by the time I got downstairs. I drove to Verona, the flagship bistro Judith had opened last year in Soho. From the outside, it looked like a cathedral to haute cuisine. Inside, it felt like Versailles had decided to flirt with modern lighting. Gold sconces, black marble, and a host stand shaped like an open recipe book. A hostess in heels and icy detachment asked if I had a reservation. "Nope," I said, smiling. "But I'm not here for a table. I'm here about the future." That caught her off guard. She blinked. "I'd like to speak to Judith Verona," I said smoothly. "Investor interest. She'll want to hear this." She gave me a once-over, then disappeared behind a velvet curtain. A minute later, Judith herself emerged. She wore deep green like it was armor and carried a tablet under one arm. Her hair was tied back tight, her expression even tighter. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "How nice of Wolfe to send his watchdog." I grinned. "Watchdog with a wallet, if you believe my pitch." "I don't," she said, "but I'm curious." She led me through the dining area, clean, quiet, with staff moving like chess pieces on a lacquered board. We went past the kitchen's swinging door into a private tasting room where the scent of basil clung to the air like expensive perfume. "So," she said, folding her arms, "why are you really here?" I sat. Last night, someone tampered with Wolfe's dinner, left a burn mark in the lasagna. It looked like a message. She tilted her head. "And you think I broke into your kitchen to deface a noodle?" "Not you, necessarily. But you did say some messages aren't meant to be tasted." She studied me a moment, then moved to the glass wall overlooking the kitchen. From here, we could see the staff in motion. 4 sous chefs, 2 runners, and 1 guy who looked like he wanted to throw his pan at someone. "That's Matteo," she said. "Our saucier. Brilliant temper and temperamental brilliance. I'm looking for someone who could leave a burnt pattern into food without disrupting the dish." She turned, arms still folded. "Matteo could do that. With a heated ring, perhaps. Old chef's trick for caramelizing sugar over a stencil. Did he visit the brownstone? Not to my knowledge, but Judith Verona's reach, I'm told, is longer than her spatula." That wasn't a denial, and she wasn't smiling. I tried a different angle. "Do you know someone who'd want Wolfe's attention enough to risk breaking into his kitchen to get it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her tablet, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward me. It displayed a photo of a man in his 30s. Narrow face, sharp jaw, salt and pepper stubble that tried a little too hard. "His name is Lennox Gill." Sounds familiar. "He was my protege once. Got bored with sauces and wanted stardom. Started a pop-up series called Inferno Plate. He uses fire, literally. Flamethrowers, branding irons, you name it." "And what's his beef with Wolfe?" She smiled tightly. "Wolfe gave a talk at a culinary symposium 2 years ago called Gill's Cooking Carnival Stunts for Pallets Raised on Gasoline." Gill was in the front row. "Ah." She walked to the glass again. "He also knows how to break into places. Once climbed into a rival's kitchen through a skylight just to swap out a spice rack before a live competition." "And you're telling me this why?" "Because if Gill is poking at Wolfe, I want to be far away when Wolfe pokes back." I thanked her, promised to pass along her fond regards to Wolfe, she did not object, and left. On my way out, I made a note to find out where Lennox Gill had popped up lately. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was reading the orchid review. He barely looked up when I gave my report. "Gill," he said thoughtfully. "A man whose vanity burns hotter than his pans. Yes, he would attempt something dramatic." "Should we invite him to lunch?" I asked. "Certainly not," Wolfe said. "But we shall compel him to come." He picked up the phone and dialed Saul Panzer. "When Wolfe calls, Saul, you know the ante's up." "Mr. Panzer," Wolfe said, "locate Lennox Gill. Discover his current address and habits. Discreetly." He hung up and looked at me. "This began with the lasagna," he said, "but it will end with fire." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a burnt mark in the cheese. Someone had challenged Wolfe's authority in his house through his food, and that was the kind of offense he didn't forget. And that's when the real heat began. By the time Saul called back that evening, the sky outside had turned the color of overcooked eggplant, and the brownstone was steeped in its usual evening hush, save for the creak of my chair as I rolled it slightly closer to the phone. Wolfe, naturally, was already in his post-dinner mode, digesting in silence with his fingertips pressed together, looking for all the world like a man meditating on the definition of the universe or the texture of a perfectly poached pear. I answered on the second ring. "Saul," I said. "Got him," came the reply. "Lennox Gill is living in a loft in Tribeca on North Moore Street. He's running a new project out of there. Experimental dining, off-book. Not listed publicly, but invite only, word of mouth." "Name of the project is Pyrosophy Subtle," I muttered. "What else?" 3 nights a week he hosts 6 guests, all culinary elite, media, or investors. He cooks in front of them. Big show. Branded plates, fire arcs, all very dramatic. His prep staff work out of the space during the day. 2 regulars, a pastry chemist and a former magician who now does heat illusions. That sounds promising and profoundly stupid. "There's more," Saul continued. "Last week, a food critic from the Chronicle left one of Gill's dinners and posted a photo of a burnt truffle soufflé. Said it looked like someone left a secret inside. That made me sit up straighter. Anything else?" "Yeah. Gill's been asking around about Wolfe. Subtle, but it's clear he wants a reaction." I thanked him, hung up, and relayed the whole thing to Wolfe, who had not moved an inch. He listened without so much as a grunt. When I finished, he let a breath out through his nose. That's the Wolfe equivalent of a scream. "Pyrosophy," he said. "The philosophical study of fire. Ridiculous. Still, apt. So, do we crash one of these invite-only torch fests? Number we invite him here." I blinked. "You want Lennox Gill in this house?" "Indeed. He wishes attention. He shall have it on my terms. But not abruptly. We require leverage. His curiosity must be made ravenous." "That could take finesse." "You have some? Not as much as you think." "Enough," he said simply. Then, after a beat, "Bring me the scrap." "The lasagna?" "No, the part that was burnt. You preserved it." Of course I had. Fritz would have thrown the whole dish into culinary exile, but I'd rescued the scorched center and tucked it into a glass jar in the fridge on a hunch. I retrieved it and placed it on Wolfe's desk like it was evidence from a museum he never wanted to visit. He examined it. Not closely. He never needed to squint. Just took it in with one long, contemptuous glance. "Bring me the magnifier." I did, and he leaned forward, one eye trained on the arc of burnt cheese and pasta. He turned the plate a 1/4 inch, then again. "Letters," he said. I bent down beside him. "There," he said. A curl, an L or a lowercase e. And there, a second mark, curved but jagged. "I don't see it." "You're not trained to, but they're there. Someone used a branding tool, likely circular in base, and pressed it in just long enough to sear the top layer. It wasn't heat alone, it was design." "And the design is letters?" "No," Wolfe murmured. "The design is language, which means this was not merely vandalism, it was communication, intended for me." "So what's the message?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But he wants me to ask that question, which I now have." There was a pause. Then he sat back and closed his eyes. "Archie, write a letter, cordial, flattering, an invitation to dine with me. Tonight, if he's free." "Tonight?" "Yes. Make it late. 9:30, after his spectacle ends." "Will he come?" "If he does not, he is cowardly. If he does, he is reckless. Both are telling." I didn't argue. I typed up the letter on Wolfe's personal stationery, heavy paper, ivory with a discreet monogram, and delivered it by hand to Pyrosophy. I didn't announce myself, just handed it to a woman folding linen napkins by the door and told her, "For Mr. Gill, It's from the man whose lasagna he tried to murder." She blinked but nodded. By 9 o'clock, we still had no reply. By 9:15, Fritz had gone to bed, muttering about godless dinners and the annihilation of civil order. By 9:28, the doorbell rang. I opened it. Lennox Gill stood on the steps like he'd just blown out a forest fire with his breath. He wore a black chef's coat with red stitching and no visible burns, but the air around him smelled faintly of charred cinnamon and ambition. He didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped past me and said, "I hope you saved me a piece." "Sadly, no," I said, closing the door, "but I could offer you a glass of Wolfe's sherry." "Better not," he said. "I like to keep my palate precise." I led him to the office. Wolfe was seated behind his desk, as always, hands in a pyramid, face blank. "Mr. Gill?" he said calmly. "Mr. Wolfe," Gill replied with a slight bow. "You have my attention." "You sought it?" "Yes." "Why?" Gill grinned and moved to the red chair across from Wolfe. He didn't ask for permission. That's something even Kramer does. "Because you're the last of a dying breed," he said. "You think taste has meaning. You think restraint is elegance. I used to think that too." Wolfe didn't react. Gill leaned in. "But you and I, we know food is communication, and I had something to say. You broke into my home." "I knocked," Gill said lightly. "Just very quietly. It was an artful message. You used fire to write in pasta." "Wouldn't be the first time," he said. "I once wrote a proposal in soufflé glaze. Got turned down, of course." Wolfe's voice dropped half a note. "What are you proposing, Mr. Gill?" Gill sat back and let his arms drape over the chair. "I want a duel." Wolfe blinked. That, for him, was a double take. "I cook," Gill said. "You taste. Then we reverse it. You give me a flavor to chase, a profile to interpret. I'll render it, and we see who leaves the table with dignity intact." Wolfe said nothing. Gill continued. "You think I'm a showman. A fraud? You're not wrong, but I'm also precise, and I'm better than you think." "No," Wolfe said. "You are clever, Mr. Gill, but cleverness is not excellence. It is flair." Gill smiled. "Then prove it. One evening, your rules." Wolfe leaned back and steepled his fingers again. "No," he said. Gill's smile faltered. "Afraid?" "Disinterested," Wolfe replied. "If you wish to speak to me, do so in words. If you wish to challenge me, publish a book." Gill stood slowly. "You disappoint me." Wolfe's eyes didn't lift. "That, Mr. Gill, is mutual." He turned and left without another word. When the door shut behind him, Wolfe exhaled long and slow. "Archie," he said. "Yes. He wants an audience. He will try again." "Then what do we do?" "We prepare," Wolfe said, "to speak a language he cannot manipulate." The smell of scorched cheese still lingered in the air, and I had a feeling the next message wouldn't arrive on a plate. The next morning, Wolfe didn't rise for breakfast. This wasn't abnormal in itself. His relationship with time was famously selective, but it was enough to make Fritz nervous. The lasagna incident still weighed heavily on him, not to mention last night's visit from Lennox Gill. The kitchen had been scrubbed twice, and Fritz was now tiptoeing around the stove like it might explode. Wolfe finally summoned me at 10:30. I found him in the plant rooms, speaking softly to a Miltonia that he claimed was suffering from too much attention and not enough respect, which may as well have been his personal credo. He didn't look up as I entered, just gestured toward the bench beside him. "He'll make another move," he said. "You think Gill's not done yet? He is incapable of ending things on someone else's terms." I nodded. "Then what are we watching for? Another flambé telegram in the dessert?" He straightened, gave the orchid a final glance, and turned toward the stairs. "Not here. He's already breached the brownstone once. To do so again would risk his mystique. No, he'll try to provoke us in his domain." You want me back at Pyrosophy? Yes, not as a guest, as a shadow. Wolfe's plan, as always, unfolded with the deliberate precision of a clockmaker. He had me place a call to Lon Cohen at the Gazette, who owed us a favor and could grant me press credentials under a food and culture byline. With that in place, I'd be able to attend one of Gil's infamous private dinners without needing a forged invitation or a flaming sword. I arrived at Gil's loft that evening, dressed in my best approximation of a food columnist. Dark jacket, discreet notebook, and a skeptical look that suggested I'd recently reviewed a creme brulee that offended me personally. The entrance to Pyrosophy was unmarked, but the doorman, an ex-stuntman with cauliflower ears, took one look at my press badge and let me in with a shrug. The loft was dim and theatrical. The long dining table glowed under overhead lights, and a low hum of music and conversation filled the space like dry ice. I counted 6 guests. 2 I recognized from Wolfe's old guest list. One was a television food historian, the other a cookbook agent who had once tried to sign Wolfe and walked away with indigestion. Lennox Gill entered with a gust of confidence. He wore a different coat tonight, this one silver-threaded with flared cuffs, and he made a show of extinguishing a torch with a single clap. The room responded with polite laughter and a few gasps. Gill basked in it. He spotted me almost immediately. "Ah," he said. "Mr. Goodwin." I thought I smelled skepticism. I smiled. "I'm writing a piece called Dancing with Fire, the Pyrosophy Doctrine. I figured you'd appreciate it." "I'm flattered," he said, and waved me toward an empty seat. "Just don't inhale too deeply. Some of tonight's flavors are volatile." The dinner began. Each course was a performance. Gill branded his initials into a duck breast with a copper sigil. He smoked fennel using a handheld cannon that let out a sound like a sneeze from a dragon. He carved frozen foie gras with a blade chilled in liquid nitrogen and presented it on plates embossed with a faint, crisp symbol, an L wrapped in a curve, nearly identical to the one that had been seared into Wolfe's lasagna. That wasn't coincidence. I kept my cool and took notes. The guests oohed and awed. Gill flourished. But I noticed something else. Near the back of the kitchen, behind the theatrics, a narrow table was set apart. It held 2 copper pans, a rack of unused herbs, and a covered dome. It wasn't touched during service. None of the assistants approached it, but every few minutes, Gill's eyes flicked toward it. It wasn't decor. After dessert, a scorched mango tart that tasted like ambition with a citrus twist, Gill made his final bow and thanked everyone for their devotion. As guests rose, he made his way to me. "Thoughts?" he asked. "Plenty," I said. "But my editor likes a clean narrative." "Tell me, what's under the dome?" He tilted his head. "Curiosity becomes you." "That's not a denial." He leaned in. "You want to know what Wolfe really missed in that lasagna? It wasn't flavor, it was origin. Heat leaves a fingerprint. I'm sure he taught you that." "He taught me never to brand cheese unless you're ready to be disinvited from dinner for life." Gill chuckled. "Then perhaps he'll like what comes next. Tell him I'm preparing something subtler." He turned on his heel and disappeared behind the curtain. I didn't follow. Wolfe had said, "Observe, not provoke." Besides, I had what I needed. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, reading Pliny the Elder and pretending not to care that I was 20 minutes late. I gave him the rundown, every torch flare, every guest, every sly insult. When I described the hidden table, his eyelid twitched. "He's staging something," I said. The dome wasn't touched, but he kept checking it like a paranoid waiter. Wolfe grunted. "And he said you missed something in the lasagna." "Not flavor. Origin," he said. "Heat leaves a fingerprint." Wolfe closed the book gently. "He is correct." "That's not reassuring." "It shouldn't be. A man who speaks in metaphors about combustion is rarely planning a compliment. I waited while he thought. At length, Wolfe said, "He is constructing a performance, not of cuisine, but of meaning. He intends his next message to be theatrical." I nodded. "And you think we're the target again?" "No," Wolfe said. "Not we. Me." He stood, an event in itself, and crossed to the globe cabinet for a glass of Madeira. He didn't speak again until the liquid had stilled in the glass. We must compel him to act before he is ready, before he believes the stage is his. Any idea how? He looked at me over the rim. "Yes. We issue a review." I blinked. "You want to critique pyrosophy?" "I want you to." "Wolfe, no offense, but I'm not exactly the New Yorker." "That is why it will work. You're not a critic. You're a witness, honest, untrained, and thoroughly unimpressed." I was beginning to like it. "You'll write it tonight," he said. "Lon will publish it in the Sunday edition, a featured column, page 3. With a headline." "What headline?" Wolfe gave the faintest smile. "Flash-over flavor, the fire that missed its mark." I whistled low. "That'll sting," nodded. "Good. Let it." We both knew what Gill's next move would be, and Wolfe would be ready. This time, not to react, but to counter. The Sunday paper hit the street at 6:12 a.m. By 7:03, Fritz had cut out the column, placed it neatly beside Wolfe's breakfast tray, poached eggs, roasted tomato, rye toast, and retreated as if handling something radioactive. Wolfe didn't touch the food. He read the article in its entirety without a word. That meant he was pleased. I, of course, had read it 3 times already. The headline did the heavy lifting, flash-over flavor, the fire that missed its mark. But the column itself was Wolfe's strategy through and through, disguised in my voice. I'd written it in the same cool tone I might use to describe a Broadway show that set the curtains on fire but forgot the lines. I described Gill's table, theatrics, his penchant for torching garnish, and his habit of inserting himself between the food and the flavor. I didn't call him a fraud. I just called him distracting. Wolfe's favorite line had been, the souffle gasped theatrically, but when the smoke cleared, it said nothing. That was pure Wolfe. I just gave it my name. By 10 o'clock, the phone rang. Fritz answered, then passed it to me with a face like he'd tasted bad vinegar. "It's him," he said, "the fire starter." I took the receiver. "Good morning, Mr. Gill." "You wrote it," Gill said flatly. "You and your maestro." "He doesn't dictate," I said. "He observes." "Then observe this," Gill snapped. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. Come hungry, but come ready." The line went dead. Wolfe didn't ask what he'd said. He already knew. Instead, he summoned me to the office and instructed me to place 3 calls, one to Lon Cohen, one to Saul Panza, and one to Inspector Kramer. "That's quite a trio," I said. "You planning to throw a party?" "No," Wolfe replied. "A trap." He didn't elaborate, which was his way of telling me he would in his time. And it did feel like we'd reached the threshold of something. Wolfe didn't mind insults. He'd been called everything from glutton to godless, but he loathed pretension dressed as genius, especially when it tampered with food. He saw Gill now not as an eccentric chef, but as an intellect on a leash, uncontrolled, theatrical, and, most of all, unprincipled. By noon, Saul had confirmed that Gill was preparing something elaborate. A refrigerated truck had arrived at the loft, delivering crates labeled carbon sculpture, meringue resin, and theatrical ice. Wolfe frowned when he heard that one. "It will be performative," he murmured, "and it will be a message. Should we cancel your subscription to meaning, or are we walking in blind?" "We walk in aware," he said, "but not alone." At 6:30, Fritz reluctantly handed me a sealed container of dinner, duck and tamarind glaze with grilled escarole, which I promised I'd return untouched. Wolfe would eat later, after the performance. He insisted on that as if he knew the event ahead of us would drain appetite and color. At 7:45, I stood once more before the unmarked black door on North Moore Street. Same doorman, same blank look, but this time he opened it without my badge. He simply said, "Mr. Gill is waiting." The loft had changed. Where last week had been dim and dramatic, now it glowed like the inside of a lantern. The table was gone. In its place stood a raised platform, circular, ringed in glass, with 6 chairs evenly spaced around it. The walls were darkened, draped in black cloth, and a single spotlight hung above the center of the ring. A small stage, a kitchen, a theater, all in one. I wasn't alone. I counted 6 guests again, some repeats, some new. One was a food editor I knew by reputation, another a famous Instagram critic whose eyebrows had their own mailing list. But what made me blink was the 6th chair, already occupied. Saul Panzer, in a navy suit, sipping seltzer like he belonged. He didn't look at me. That was Saul's gift. At exactly 8 o'clock, the spotlight brightened. Gill stepped into it. He wore white this time, immaculate like a surgeon, but with a red silk cravat that caught the light every time he moved. He spoke softly, but every word hit like a match. "Tonight," he said, "we abandon the idea that food is meant to nourish. Tonight, we burn tradition, not in rebellion, but in revelation." The lights dimmed slightly, and a rolling tray appeared beside him. On it sat 6 domes. He lifted the first. Beneath it, a sculpture, recognizable at once. A replica of Wolfe's head, molded in pastry, eyes closed. The scent of vanilla and almond drifted off it. The guests gasped. He lifted the second. A flaming heart made of spun sugar and something red. Maybe pomegranate syrup, maybe dye. Third, a small charred book made of stacked millefeuille, its pages crisped at the edges. Fourth, a glass cube filled with smoke. When the dome lifted, the smoke dissipated to reveal a small rectangle of parchment with the words, "Ego feeds no one," etched in chocolate. Fifth, a plate of pasta, familiar. Lasagna, scorched at the center with the same circular mark, and the 6th dome. He didn't lift. He turned to the audience. Every dish is a message, but not every message is received. Tonight I offer not meals, but meaning. I offer what your critics can't digest. He moved to the center of the ring, lifted the 6th dome, and for a moment I thought I saw Wolfe himself under there. It wasn't him, of course. It was another sculpture, closer to abstraction, a mound of food that looked like chaos incarnate. Charcoal pasta spiraled around a central orb of blackened fondant, with knives, real knives, plunged into its base. Gill's voice grew quiet. "This is for him." He stared at me when he said it. "Tell him," he said, "that this is what restraint breeds. A meal no one can eat." I stood. "Then you've answered your own question." Gill tilted his head. "You said food is communication," I continued, "but if no one can eat it, no one can hear it. That's not art, that's silence." He blinked. Behind me, I heard the door open. I didn't need to turn to know it was Wolfe. He hadn't said he'd come, but somehow I'd known he would. He stepped into the circle. Not fast, not theatrical, just present. Gill stared. The audience froze. Wolfe looked at the lasagna, then at the parchment, then at Gill. "You can set the room on fire," Wolfe said. "But if no one is warmed by it, you've accomplished nothing." Gill opened his mouth. Wolfe raised a hand. "You used food to express anger. That is forgivable. But you used my kitchen to do it. That is not." Gill said nothing. Wolfe stepped closer. "You are not a chef," he said. "You are an arsonist with a vocabulary." Then, calmly, he turned and left. The silence he left behind was not theatrical. It was final. The car ride back from Gil's fiery dinner spectacle was conducted in silence, which in Wolfe's language was the equivalent of a full-throated aria. I didn't press him. His hands were steepled, his eyes shut, and he was inhaling through his nose like he meant to analyze the air. Not once did he comment on the absurdity we'd just witnessed. The pastry effigy, the flaming sugar hearts, the lasagna that looked like a crime scene. But I could see it behind his eyelids. He wasn't just offended, he was calculating. When we reached the brownstone, Wolfe went straight to the elevator. I followed on foot, slower, with one hand brushing the walls. I passed Fritz in the hall. Fritz raised his eyebrows, wordless. I gave him a shake of the head that said, "Don't ask." Wolfe didn't summon me to the office until 10 o'clock, well past his usual bedtime. He was seated in his chair, robe on, brandy in hand, eyes sharp. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Just one?" I said. "Because from where I'm standing, we've got a fireworks hobbyist with a vendetta, a violated kitchen, and a lasagna with a burn mark that might qualify as libel." He didn't take the bait. "Mr. Gil is not merely seeking attention," Wolfe said. "He's staging escalation." "I figured that out around the flaming effigy." "No," Wolfe said. "He is baiting me, yes. But it's no longer for amusement or insult. There is something he wishes to obscure, and for that, he needs my reputation to be preoccupied." "Obscure what?" Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, thinking. He is not alone in this. Judith Verona's involvement may not be direct, but she is not innocent, and yet she distances herself from him with deliberate elegance. She gave us his name. Precisely. She handed us a name, and we accepted it too quickly. That was her intention. I frowned, pacing in front of the bookshelves. "So she wanted us to chase him?" "Yes, because the more theatrical Mr. Gil becomes, the less we look elsewhere. He draws our eyes while something else is being rearranged." "That sounds dangerously close to metaphor," I said. "I regret that it does," he replied, then pointed at the phone. "Call Saul." When Saul answered, Wolfe's instructions were precise and brief. "Locate everyone in Gil's inner circle, from culinary staff to sponsors to investors, especially investors, and specifically anyone connected to Judith Verona's network in the last 6 months." After Wolfe hung up, he turned back to me. "She's maneuvering. This isn't just ego, it's infrastructure. Something is shifting under the surface." I nodded. "And Gil is the smoke." "Exactly. He has no patience for finance, for logistics, for business. He is too volatile. But Verona, she is meticulous. If she's funneling money through him, there's a reason." By the next morning, Saul had names. 3 major backers of Pyrosophy, all quietly connected to Verona's restaurant group through shell companies. One of them was a man named Victor Bevel, ostensibly an art collector, but better known among insiders as a silent fixer for expensive transitions, real estate flips, restaurant turnovers, and the occasional hostile acquisition disguised as a gracious retirement. Wolfe didn't blink when Saul read the name. "I know Bevel," he said. "He once tried to poach Fritz." I blinked. "He what?" "6 years ago," Wolfe said. "Offered him a position at a boutique kitchen in Monaco. Promised full creative freedom. Fritz declined, of course." "Out of loyalty?" "Out of sense," Wolfe said. "The kitchen had no burners. It was to be an all-molecular, cold-prep lab for display only. The food was intended to be seen, not eaten." "Let me guess. Judith Verona was the designer." Wolfe nodded. "Now do you see?" I did. Gil was the fire, Verona was the fuse, and Bevel was the bank. But none of them had broken the law. Yet. So I asked Wolfe the obvious. "What do we do?" He looked at me. "We wait." I groaned. "You know I hate that." He smiled. "Yes." But the wait didn't last long. At 4 that afternoon, A messenger arrived at the brownstone with a long, slender envelope bearing Verona's seal. Wolfe slit it open and read in silence. Then he handed it to me. It was an invitation. You are formally invited to attend the launch of Verona Guild's new culinary performance studio, The Crucible, Monday evening. One night only. Attendance limited. For those who dare to taste the future. There was no RSVP number, no address, just a time, 8 o'clock, and the note, transportation will arrive for you. Wolfe didn't speak for a long while. Then he said, she wants an audience. This is not merely for Gil. She wants you to witness something. She wants me to endorse it, Wolfe said, even if by presence alone. But you won't. No, he said, but I will attend, and I will bring an end to it. He dictated a short note for me to deliver to Inspector Kramer. Not a formal complaint, not even a heads up. Just a signal, a chess player knocking once on the edge of the board. I delivered it personally and returned in time to change into something that didn't smell like brandy and suspicion. At 7:45, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. Wolfe, dressed in dark gray with a deep blue cravat, stepped out with the gravity of a man attending not an event, but a reckoning. I followed, slipping in beside him. The ride was silent. The car took us to an industrial district by the East River. The building looked abandoned until the doors opened on their own, revealing a corridor lit by orange flame sconces. A hostess waited at the end, silent, masked, and draped in red. She led us down the corridor into what had once been a factory floor. Now it was a temple to combustion. Tall pillars of sculpted fire lined the walls. The center stage, a hexagonal platform, was surrounded by a circular moat of actual flame. Above it, a suspended kitchen station lowered slowly from the ceiling. Gil stood beneath it, arms outstretched. He was no longer wearing white. He was dressed in black and gold, like a magician ready for his final trick. Verona stood at the far end of the stage, still, regal, watching Wolfe. The lights dimmed. Gil's voice echoed through hidden speakers. "Tonight," he said, "we end the past." I felt Wolfe shift beside me. He didn't move often, but when he did, things happened. And I had the feeling something very final was about to begin. Wolfe's shift beside me was subtle, just the settling of his weight from one foot to the other, but I knew the man well enough to recognize it as an act of intent. Gil's theatrics had crossed a line the moment they descended from ego into ideology. That opening line, "Tonight we end the past," had been rehearsed, dramatic, and to Wolfe's mind, irredeemably stupid. It also confirmed something he'd suspected since the lasagna was branded like a cattle warning. This wasn't about food anymore. It was about conquest. A low, rhythmic thrum of music began, pulsing from beneath the floorboards. Lights circled the room in slow red arcs, and the audience, dozens now, not just critics, but potential investors, television producers, and people who enjoyed setting money on fire, watched in anticipatory silence. Gil walked the hexagonal stage with the practiced poise of a man performing genius. His hands moved in wide arcs. Flames burst up from jets at each corner of the platform with each phrase. "Cuisine," he said, "has been enslaved by tradition. We are taught to preserve, to protect, to replicate." A small metallic sphere was lowered into his waiting hands. He held it up. But real innovation, real creation, begins only when we destroy. He dropped the orb into a shallow pan. There was a hiss, a flash, and the unmistakable scent of scorched citrus and sulfur. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, the corners of his mouth had turned down by a millimeter, which, in Wolfe terms, was a declaration of war. Verona hadn't moved. She stood by the edge of the room, watching Gil, watching us, watching the audience. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were locked on Wolfe like she was waiting for the exact moment of ignition, Not on stage, but across from her. I'd seen enough staged dinners and baited rivalries to know a setup when I saw one. Gil continued, lifting a set of tongs like a sacred relic. He extracted a slice of something charred and delicate and placed it onto a wide ceramic plate shaped like a cracked mirror. Another assistant followed him onto the stage, holding a small tank. Gil opened the valve. Smoke spiraled into the air, weaving through the red light. "Tonight," he said, "we serve extinction. That which refuses to evolve must burn." He gestured to the assistants who wheeled out carts. One stopped in front of Wolfe and me. "Chef's invitation," the woman said. Wolfe didn't look at her. "No, it's a single bite. I do not accept invitations wrapped in symbolism and served with arrogance." Gil heard it. He didn't pause. "I offer no apology to the old," he said. "Only the future deserves a plate." I turned to Wolfe. "Should I flip the table now, or do we wait for the main course?" "No," Wolfe murmured. "We wait for him to stumble." The plates were distributed. A thin layer of food that looked more like sculpture than sustenance. Gilded beet ash, a gelatin prism, something that might have once been bread or bone. No one touched it yet. They waited. Gil moved back to center stage. The lights lowered further. One final spotlight now bathed the entire platform in a warm amber glow. He raised a thin piece of paper in one hand. "This," he said, "is the last recipe Nero Wolfe ever published." Or so they say. The paper caught light at the edges. Flames curled inward. "I've improved it." That was it. Wolfe opened his eyes. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice. But the silence that followed his exhale had the weight of falling marble. "That," he said, "was your error." Gil tilted his head. "Because I lit a piece of paper? Because you thought a recipe is a conclusion?" Wolfe took a single step forward, away from me, into the fire-lit circle of spectators. A recipe is a beginning, a structure. It contains within it a promise. To consume it without understanding is ignorance. To change it without respect is vandalism. Gil laughed. A few guests tittered, confused. Verona moved then, just one step, toward the edge of the stage. Wolfe raised a hand. "You are not merely disrespectful. You are derivative. You mistook spectacle for mastery, and you let someone convince you it was enough." Now that got Gil's attention, and Verona's. Wolfe turned slightly, just enough to let the whole room feel his pivot. "She built this stage," he said. "You lit the fire." Gil narrowed his eyes. "You think she used me?" "I think," Wolfe said, "she gave you a toy and let you break it in public." Verona's voice finally cut through the silence. Smooth, cold. "You speak as if this is loss." Wolfe turned to her. "It is." She stepped fully into the ring of light. "It's transition, from reverence to reinvention. You refuse to evolve." Wolfe stepped forward. "Number Y refused to be irrelevant. That is why I'm still here." The crowd didn't move. No one breathed. Wolfe turned back to Gil. "You want truth, Mr. Gil. Your brilliance is real, but it was stolen, and it ends tonight." Gil's mouth opened, then closed, and in that silence, the emergency lights flared. 2 plainclothes officers entered from the far end, followed by Saul Panzer and, like thunder arriving late, Inspector Kramer. Gil turned, confused. Kramer's voice cut through like a cleaver. "Lennox Gil, you're wanted for questioning, fraud, conspiracy, possibly worse." The room stirred. Wolfe didn't flinch. Verona tried to speak. Saul blocked her. Wolfe raised one hand again, an old Roman senator calling for order. "Innovate," he said, his voice low and calm. "But do not counterfeit. That is the line." Kramer moved in. Gil didn't resist. Wolfe turned, stepped back into the darkness, and spoke only once more. "Let's go home, Archie." And just like that, the The fire died. The ride back to the brownstone was quiet, but it wasn't silence. It was Wolfe thinking, which sounded like controlled breathing and the occasional flex of fingers against upholstery. I knew better than to interrupt. The air still carried the taste of scorched theatrics and smug ambition. Wolfe had walked into Verona and Gill's crucible and doused it not with fury, but precision. The flame had gone out not in drama, but in disgrace. We arrived just before midnight. Fritz met us at the door, clearly waiting up and clearly pretending he hadn't been. He didn't ask for details, and Wolfe didn't offer any. He only removed his overcoat, muttered something about chamomile, and disappeared into the kitchen with the same solemnity you'd expect from a monk preparing tea for a funeral. By the time I'd settled in my office with a tumbler of scotch and a notepad on my knee, Wolfe summoned me. He was already seated behind his desk, robe belted, cravat loose, eyes alive. Saul's report arrived. I raised my eyebrows. Efficient. He was watching Bevel. Bevel was watching Verona. Wolfe slid a small folder across the desk. Inside was a series of grainy photos. Verona entering and exiting a nondescript midtown office building over several nights. Then another photo, this one of her and Gill seated in a glass-walled conference room, both facing a third man I didn't recognize. Who's the extra? His name is Herbert Imler, Wolfe said. He runs a marketing consortium, specializes in repackaging culinary ventures for international franchising. High-end ghost kitchens, menu automation, spectacle without presence. I exhaled. So Verona and Gill were never trying to build a restaurant. They were building a brand. Wolfe nodded, and the moment I attended, it would have become valid. Even my disapproval would serve them. They intended to sell my image as the relic being replaced. A marketing foil. I laughed under my breath. So you weren't the audience. You were the sacrifice. Wolfe didn't smile. Mr. Gill was the pawn. Verona was positioning him as the emotional bait, the troubled artist, the misunderstood genius who triumphs over the old guard. She would have framed it beautifully, elegant betrayal, culinary succession. And instead she gets a fraud charge and a public scene. The charge won't stick, Wolfe said. Kramer knows it, but the spectacle is broken, the illusion has collapsed, and Mr. Gill has been shown the shadow behind his flame. I leaned back in the chair and swirled the ice in my glass. Then that's it. Case closed. No, Wolfe said, and this time his voice dropped half a register. Not until she comes here. You think she will? She has no choice, he said. You will call her in the morning. You think she'll accept? She'll want the final word. That I couldn't argue with. Verona arrived the next day just before noon, dressed in gray silk and quiet anger. She didn't wait for me to escort her to the office. She entered like she'd been born inside the building, moved like the chairs belonged to her, and sat without invitation. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't even nod. She spoke first. You humiliated him. Wolfe inclined his head. Number he did that himself. You used him to reach me. On the contrary, Wolfe said. He put himself between us. He lit the fire. I simply named the smoke. She crossed her legs, composed, controlled. But there was tension behind the eyes. Not fear, irritation, like someone whose chessboard had been knocked over before she could deliver the winning move. You could have walked away, she said. You came into my house, Wolfe replied. You scorched my dinner. It wasn't personal. That, he said, was your second error. She tilted her head. You think this is over? No, Wolfe said. I think it has returned to its origin. She frowned. You began as a cook, he said. You made things. Real things. Now you orchestrate illusions. You believe spectacle is substance. You are not alone in this mistake. But you are perhaps its finest craftsman. Verona narrowed her eyes. You still think the future belongs to you? No, Wolfe, said, finally reaching for his glass of beer, but the present does. She rose. He didn't. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "He admired you once." "And I," Wolfe said, "pity him now." She left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and I exhaled. "Well," I said. That was polite. Wolfe sipped his beer and closed his eyes. It was necessary. We didn't speak of her again. The next morning, Kramer dropped by, not in his usual burst of irritation, but with the faint, begrudging tone of a man who'd seen a performance but hadn't bought a ticket. "I should have known it was going to blow up," he muttered, flopping onto the red chair. "Anything that smells that good and feels that staged. Trouble," Wolfe grunted. "Imler walked," Kramer said. "No proof he did anything illegal. Gill's still in the wind, but my guess is he's licking his wounds somewhere cold and dry. Verona lawyered up before she left the building." "You won't pursue her," Wolfe said. "No," Kramer admitted, "but I will keep an eye on her." "As will I," Wolfe murmured. Kramer glanced at me. "You put all this in the report?" "I never put everything in the report." Kramer grunted. "Good, neither do I." He left 15 minutes later, not happier, but quieter. That evening, Fritz served the repaired lasagna. No burn, no mystery, just the original recipe. Wolfe ate in silence, 3 bites slower than usual. He said nothing, but when he finished, he looked at Fritz and said, "Thank you." Fritz nodded and returned to the kitchen with the faintest of smiles. I leaned back in my chair and swirled the last sip of wine in my glass. Wolfe caught the movement and said, "You're considering writing it all down." "Maybe," I said. "It's got drama, fire, betrayal, culinary metaphors." He shook his head. "It would be read as performance." So, he said, setting his fork down. "Let it be forgotten. Some flames are best extinguished." I grinned. "But if someone ever serves you a scorched noodle again, then," Wolfe said, "you may write the sequel." And that, finally, was dinner. 3 days passed. The brownstone returned to its natural state. Silent, controlled, and just slightly too warm, Fritz reclaimed the kitchen with ceremonial precision, and the orchid rooms regained their solitude. Wolfe resumed his regular schedule, which is to say, he remained immovable in body but more than usually active in thought, though he said little. Whatever smoldered in his mind was slow burning, not yet ready for air. I knew better than to prod. I did my usual rounds. I checked in with Lon Cohen, who reported that Verona's PR machine had gone quiet. No press releases, no damage control, no whispered justifications. Silence, when coming from someone like her, is a move, not surrender, but reloading. Saul confirmed she'd withdrawn from 3 restaurant projects in planning and had ceased communication with Imler. No calls, no meetings, not even a text. Gill had vanished entirely. On the 4th morning, something arrived. It was a small box, wooden, smooth, lacquered, no label, no return address. Fritz found it on the front steps beside the milk crate and brought it to me with both hands, as though it might hum or detonate. I set it on Wolfe's desk. He stared at it without touching it. His expression didn't change, but I saw the faint tightening at the bridge of his nose. "Open it," he said. I flipped the latch. Inside was a single white envelope, thick, monogrammed. Verona's initials. No surprise. Beneath the envelope, nestled into black velvet lining, was a small copper ring. Scorched, pitted, familiar. The branding tool. The one Gill, or someone under his instruction, had used to sear Wolfe's lasagna. Wolfe didn't touch it. I handed him the letter. He opened it, read once, and passed it to me. "You were never meant to eat it. You were meant to recognize it. We both know I could have done worse." But I wanted you to see the line before others try to erase it. No signature, no direct threat, just prose. Verona's kind of prose. Cold, elegant, self-exonerating. I read it twice. So, I said, that's her epilogue. No, Wolfe said. It's her warning. I leaned forward. You think she's threatening you? No, he said calmly. She's informing me of what comes next. Not from her, from others like her. Spectacle with teeth? Wolfe nodded. They'll come with flame and call it light. They'll wrap destruction in language, and they will offer it as progress. I let out a low breath. She means it. Yes, Wolfe said. But she misjudges me again. How so? He looked down at the copper ring. She believes I fear irrelevance. He didn't say more. Didn't need to. That afternoon, he dictated a short letter. Formal, clipped, unmistakable. It was addressed to a culinary ethics board I'd never heard of, and it included precise documentation of the Gil Verona affair, including the nature of the food tampering, the use of unregistered fire elements, and several blurred lines between culinary expression and endangerment. He attached Saul's notes, my field accounts, and even a retyped version of the lasagna report. It wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to record. Wolfe never believed in memory that could fade. If something mattered, it went on paper. 2 days later, a copy of Cuisine and Conscience Quarterly arrived. Wolfe's review was inside. Not the lasagna, not Gil's Inferno, but a 5-paragraph essay under his byline titled On the Nature of Flame. It was Wolfe in full. No names, no venom, just a careful dismantling of the ideology Verona had tried to pitch. He never called her out. But he called her kind out, line by line. The last paragraph stuck with me. Let them burn. Let them dazzle. But let no one confuse combustion with craft. A meal may arrive in smoke, but if it feeds no one, it ends as ash. I tore that page out and tacked it to the bulletin board beside my desk. Not out of sentiment, out of respect. The next week came and went without another knock on the door, another show of smoke. But it didn't feel like the end. Not really. It felt like we'd walked out of a room where the fire had gone low, but the embers still glowed under the ash. On Thursday, Wolfe summoned me with a clipped, almost casual, Archie. I found him in the office with a stack of correspondence before him, unusual for a man who preferred to let mail marinate a few days before handling it. He gestured to the stack. 4 offers. From? Publication houses. 1 from a culinary school. 1 from an investment group. And what do they want? To discuss legacy. I raised a brow. Yours? He gave a small shrug. They want to preserve it or co-opt it, depending on who's asking. What did you tell them? I haven't responded. He tapped the copper ring. It still sat on the desk, untouched. I leaned against the door frame. You're not interested. I am, he said, but not in what they offer. He turned his gaze to the window. The light had shifted. Autumn had started creeping toward the city, dulling the edges of the buildings, laying a soft haze over everything. When the world insists you be replaced, Wolfe said quietly, the correct answer is to remain. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. That night, Fritz made lasagna again. Same recipe, same method. But when he placed it before Wolfe, he did something new. He leaned in and said, I added nothing, changed nothing. Wolfe looked up and nodded. And I thought, for once, we might finally be done. But after dinner, as I cleared the table and Wolfe returned to his chair with his beer, I passed by the orchid room and noticed something different. One of the orchids had been moved, just slightly, shifted 2 inches to the left on the shelf. No note, no explanation. Fritz swore he hadn't touched it. I told Wolfe. He went quiet. Then he looked at me. Archie, he said, It appears someone wishes to remind us they are not gone. I nodded. Should we worry? No, Wolfe said. We should remain aware. And that was that. Not an ending. A vigil. The orchid had moved. Not far, just enough to betray intent. Fritz insisted, 3 times in escalating tones of defensiveness, that he hadn't touched it. I believed him. Wolfe didn't even ask. He merely stared at the shelf like it had uttered something unkind and not quite untrue. The orchid in question was a Cattleya triani, its bloom full and faultless, positioned dead center on its tray yesterday and now, today, nudged precisely 2 inches to the left, which meant someone had been in the room. Not carelessly, not maliciously, deliberately. That night, Wolfe ate without comment. But he did not read. He did not retire early. He sat in the office, beer untouched, staring into the space just above the typewriter as though letters were being spelled there in smoke. At 10:30, he finally said, "You will check the locks." "I already did," I told him. "Twice. There's no sign of forced entry." "No," he said. "There wouldn't be." I looked at him. "You think it was her?" "I think it was a messenger." "She's not done?" "She never intended to be." I leaned forward. So what was the orchid supposed to say? He looked at me. That the line she claimed to show me, the one not to be crossed, was only the beginning. The implication sat heavy in the room. That it wasn't about food anymore, or performance. It was about territory, about sanctum. I knew Wolfe well enough to understand what that meant. The brownstone was more than a home. It was his fortress, his cathedral, his operating room. To enter it without consent, even to move a flower, was an act of war. The next morning I went through the house room by room, no windows disturbed, no prints, nothing missing, nothing added, not a single mark except that damn orchid shifted 2 inches east of reverence. The only clue I found, if you could call it that, was a faint scent on the brass doorknob to the orchid room, a trace of citrus and clove. Not strong, not commercial. Something custom. I brought that to Wolfe. He nodded. Verona's signature. She once had a custom kitchen cleaner prepared with those oils. Said it was civilized acidity. Why would she use it here? She wouldn't, he said. Not unless she wanted me to know. She left a calling card. He lifted his gaze to me, slow and precise. She left a warning. It wasn't just that she could get in, it was that she had, and nothing had stopped her. I called Saul. He checked surveillance from the block. No signs of forced access, no unusual visitors, no service personnel unaccounted for. So I did something I'd never done before. I brought in someone else. Her name was Daphne Cord, and she was a discreet specialist in building access control. A kind of locksmith for the hyperparanoid. She'd helped Saul once on a case involving a missing heir in a vault disguised as a wine cellar. She arrived that afternoon in a taupe coat and carried nothing but a thin leather bag. Wolfe didn't greet her. He simply allowed her in and retreated to the orchids. She examined every door, every window, every lock. She tested seals, watched air pressure changes, even ran a slow sensor across the basement vent lines. I followed her for an hour, offering answers, drinking coffee, saying little. Finally, in the back hall near the pantry, she paused. "This seal," she said, pointing to the frame around the service entrance. It was broken, cleanly resealed. Whoever came in knew how to unseat the strip without leaving. Visible damage. You'd need thermal scans to catch it, not amateur work. So it wasn't luck. No, she said. It was practice. She replaced the seal, gave me a list of reinforcements, and handed me a card. Install this, she said, tapping it. Silent alert on re-entry. It won't stop them, but you'll know when they return. When? She paused at the door, thoughtful. If they moved a flower, she said, they'll move something else. But not right away. They'll wait until you stop noticing. That evening I relayed it all to Wolfe. He didn't react, but after dinner I found him in the orchid room alone, not inspecting, not cataloguing, just standing there. Still, like he was listening. The days that followed were uneventful. The brownstone returned to calm. Fritz cooked, Wolfe read. I typed, filed, and visited the city's quieter corners for any whisper of Verona or Gil or anyone orbiting their kind of storm. Nothing. Until Tuesday. I was walking past the front closet when I saw it. The umbrella stand. There were always 3 items in that stand. Wolfe's black-capped walking stick, a plain, tightly rolled umbrella I once picked up on a rainy stakeout in Yonkers, and a second-hand cane from a pawn shop Wolfe liked for no discernible reason. But now there were 4. The extra item was barely noticeable. A thin, polished stick with a brass handle shaped like a crescent. Elegant, subtle. Not mine, not Wolfe's. I didn't touch it. I went straight to Wolfe. He followed me back and stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "She left it." I nodded. "What does it mean?" "It's not hers," he said. "It's Gil's." I turned sharply. "You're sure?" He used a similar cane once at a tasting, affectation, not necessity. He carried it when trying to appear thoughtful, a misdirect, much like this. "You think she's baiting him?" "No," Wolfe said. "She's telling me she controls him." I reached for it. Wolfe stopped me. "Leave it," he said. "If she returns, she will remove it. And if not, then it's an offering." I didn't like the sound of that. That night, Wolfe dictated a letter. It wasn't for the police. It wasn't for any public figure. It was for her. 2 lines, handwritten on his personal stationery. "You may enter, but you are always seen, and nothing you move is ever truly yours." He sealed it, signed only with his initials, and told me to place it not in the mail, but in the orchid room. On the shelf, beside the moved flower. I did. And when I checked it the next morning, the envelope was gone. The cane was gone too, but the orchid, she had moved it back. Precisely. Dead center. No fanfare. Just order restored. That afternoon, Wolfe sat in his chair, eyes closed, fingers folded, his voice nearly inaudible. "She will not return. Not physically." I nodded. "But she's still watching." "Yes." He opened his eyes. "And now she knows. We are too." Outside, the leaves were beginning to change. The city marched on, but inside the brownstone something had settled. Not in defeat, not in victory. In vigilance. And in the absence of fire, we kept the lights on. The night had settled over the brownstone like a velvet curtain, thick with silence but charged with the kind of tension only a long game of chess could produce. Wolfe sat in his chair, immovable as ever, the amber glow of his desk lamp casting sharp angles on his face. I stood nearby, glass in hand, ready for whatever closure this case had left to offer. The case had unfolded quietly, but no less devastatingly than any murder. There was no blood, no gunshot, no shattered glass. Just burnt lasagna, charred messages, carefully orchestrated performances, and the slow dance of ambition and pride. The players had taken their bows, and now only the final act remained. Wolfe cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the room like a knife through silk. "Archie," he said, "this case was not about cuisine, nor about spectacle. It was about respect and boundaries." I nodded, leaning forward on the desk. Verona and Gil tried to rewrite the rules by fire and showmanship, but you showed them the power of discipline. He smiled faintly. Discipline, restraint, those are the true ingredients of mastery. They forgot that the palate is an instrument of intellect, not impulse. I took a sip, letting the truth settle. "And the lasagna?" "Was never about lasagna," Wolfe said. "It was the line burned into the fabric of my sanctuary. A challenge that demanded a response." He stood and moved toward the orchid room. I followed. There, the Cattleya trianae bloomed serenely, perfectly centered as it had been before the first intrusion. Wolfe knelt beside it and traced a finger over the petals. She tried to unsettle the order here, to remind me that no fortress is impregnable. But order is more than bricks and locks. It is vigilance, patience, and the refusal to yield to chaos. I glanced back toward the office, the space that had witnessed so many battles fought with words instead of weapons. She sent her final message, I said. The moved orchid, the cane left at the door. But you answered with silence and steadiness. He stood, regal and calm. Yes, and in silence there is strength. The fire they ignited is now reduced to embers, save to tend, never to spread. I smiled. So, Nero Wolfe wins by staying seated, not standing on stage. Exactly, Archie. The greatest victories require no theatrics. They demand only clarity of thought and unwavering principle. I clapped him on the shoulder, the old familiar weight of our partnership settling comfortably between us. Well, boss, what'll it be? More lasagna or something less combustible? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen in days. Fritz has promised me his best. Tonight we dine on certainty. As the quiet brownstone embraced us once more, I realized that sometimes the most scorching mysteries burn not in flame, but in the cold precision of intellect. And that was the final course.